that is just one of the many stumbling blocks in the path. The other include NATO membership and territorial agreements that, in fact, do not get anywhere near Ukraine's ambitions, goals, objectives of recovering the territory all lost within their 1991 boundaries.
A historic shift here, and we're trying to work out who best can explain recent political history, and there's no one better than Times Radio presenter Adam Bolton, who joins us in the studio. Morning, Adam.
Good morning.
Fascinating line there from the John Brennan. Kate was asking about Article 5, and Article 5 is a basic article of faith for the last 75 years, since the end of the Second World War. That the reason NATO works is that if someone attacks a NATO country, everyone in NATO comes in to defend them. It's a massive, massive deterrent and has been for decades. Do you think that's a shift? That must be a shift if you can't rely on America anymore.
Well, I think there are two things here. One is America, as I understand it, is not saying it doesn't believe in Article 5. What it is saying is it doesn't want any settlement in Ukraine to be under Article 5, or under NATO indeed, which therefore means that if there were to be a further attack on Ukraine, if it wasn't covered by Article 5, there wouldn't need to be an American military response or a response by all of NATO. So yes, it's a softening of it, but it's consistent, if you like, with respecting the standing of NATO at the moment. Now, when you go further and say that there are reports, for example, that the Americans are going to withdraw their troops from the Baltic states, which would, be seen as an invitation, that would be very worrying indeed. And we know fundamentally that Trump doesn't like international agreements. He thinks it should be one for all, America first, and everyone else looking after their own interests. So clearly, I think there's concern there. And that's where I think it was really fascinating what Keir Starmer said yesterday, because Starmer sort of went first and said, look, and people have been talking about this for months, there will have to be some kind of peacekeeping force in Ukraine. And yesterday, at that European meeting, he then came out and said to the Americans, really called their bluff, said, look, this is only going to work if you are, this rather odd phrase, which we all remember from Brexit, a backstop. And I think, we just have to look at how these negotiations are going, that it may well be that Trump is going to fall back on the Europeans simply because the Russians are not prepared to give him a deal which he would find acceptable. And in those circumstances, I think it is quite interesting that we've got Keir Starmer in a position of being at these European meetings. Incidentally, there's a lot of talk about another one next Monday. Have you heard about that?
Yeah.
in Kyiv, with the European nations talking about how they think things should go ahead. And I think there is the possibility of, frankly, Starmer saying in a polite way, do you really want to go all the way, old chap, and be effectively an ally of Russia?
But he might want to go all that way. I think that's such an interesting point, because there is a thought experiment that if Putin did invade a Baltic country, would you bet your life that America would come to the aid of a NATO member?
Well, right now they'd have to.
Well, I know. By whose terms they'd have to? They'd have to by terms of an agreement, which Trump doesn't necessarily respect.
Look, I think there is a possibility. The dark possibility is basically that what's going on at the moment is Trump is more or less saying to Putin, you can have your zone of influence in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
I will look for my zone of influence elsewhere, including perhaps in Greenland, including in the Panama Canal. And that then raises the very interesting question of China, because one would have thought the logic of that attitude would say to China, okay, you can take Taiwan. But all the evidence is
showing the other direction.
That the Americans are going in the other direction there. So, it's not clear. I think, everyone keeps on going about Trump being a deal maker, and possibly not a very good deal maker, but he's done all right out of it himself. And it may well be that, there's a lot of shifting parts in this. It's not quite so dogmatic as, for example, J.D. Vance expressed it to be.
What do you make of the idea that America's just going to try and get economic gain out of this? That this is the Versailles 2.0 we've been talking about a lot this morning. That they want mineral wealth from Ukraine. They are effectively saying that will be a cost of us doing any form of deal. that could then put them in, in partnership with Russia potentially, because a lot of the mineral wealth is in the Russian-held area. So is there a world in which, I guess what this boils down to, what you're saying, is there a world in which Trump can bear being a partner of Putin rather than an adversary?
I think one can see a possibility of that, but then you get to the point where if Russia extends its sphere of influence too far, it then becomes a threat, or, it goes from being a rival to threat. I mean, one point I would make, if you talk about history, and this goes back before my time, but a lot, people need to remember what happened at the end of the Second World War, and what happened at the end of the Second World War at Yalta, and people are drawing these parallels, was Roosevelt, who was seen as, a goody and a saviour by many in the liberal world, shut Britain effectively out of the settlement in Europe after the war, shut Churchill out, and went for a division which ended up with the setting up of effectively the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, as Churchill pointed out. And let's not remember this, that was extremely good for America because America was able then to extend its influence across the Western world. So, these things can happen.
Can I ask you finally, Adam, and briefly, we've just in the last few moments had a release from Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who's calling for Parliament to be recalled. He says he's actually using the same language as the Defence Secretary John Healey, who's also been speaking in the last few moments, saying it's an era-defining moment for global security. Parliament must have a chance to debate and scrutinise the government's plans on Ukraine, which will give the Prime Minister a stronger hand in Europe. What do you make of that? Likely to happen or not?
How long are they away for?
End of recess in a week, I think, or so.
In a week or so. I suspect they may have to come back earlier next week because I think there's not going to be a parliamentary vote on putting troops into a peacekeeping force. I mean, that doesn't happen. There will be debate about it, but it appears that Labour and Conservative mainstream are quite close together. The far right and Kemi Badenoch and Reform UK have got their problems, but overall there's clearly a consensus behind the policy at the moment. We had Rishi Sunak come out yesterday. So there will need to be a parliamentary discussion. Normally what would happen is Starmer would report back on Monday on the talks.
So they're back on Monday. Yeah. So they are back in session on Monday.
I think that will be enough. He'll report back on Monday on his diplomacy this week, including yesterday. Then, of course, he's going to America at the end of next week, and then the following Monday he'll report back presumably on his discussion. So Parliament will get involved, but, frankly, I think if Parliament's away for a long time, then it's fine. But if it's a matter of days, calling for a recall Parliament is a bit of tokenism. Although, interestingly, the Liberal Democrats are certainly seizing the moment to speak out strongly on this question, whereas, in the invasion of Iraq, they were the outliers against that.
Adam Bolton, Times Radio presenter. If we had more time, we could go even further back into conflicts.
It's President's Day, George Washington and Lincoln.
Past and present, thank you for joining us on the programme this morning.
But wants a security guarantee, a backstop from America. The exact form in which that comes, we don't know yet, but it could be, some of what America provides to this war that other nations don't. Something like intelligence, technical enablers, firepower, air covers, probably a really important one here. Can you see the US agreeing with that? This is, I suppose, Keir Starmer doing a bit of negotiating himself.
It appears as if, at least at the outset, the ask is for US troop presence, or at least tilting in that direction as a perhaps solid as one can have in light of the failure of the Budapest Memorandum to cover the case when the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place 3 years ago. And I don't see that. And the Trump administration within the last week has made it clear that they're not on with respect to that particular effort. If you're talking about things that are, put it this way, more ephemeral, the question is, President Zelensky going to be satisfied as well as Prime Minister Starmer? And secondly, do they in fact include things that one way or another may put off the kind of hopes that President Trump seems to have, that if he aligns himself along these particular approaches with President Putin, he will have a deal, rather than the other way around, that if in fact steps are taken to put U.S. troops in a position actually to intervene should a deal look like it's going south, so to speak, would the Russians come along? So all of those uncertainties are out there in the longer term. And I would say it would be a little bit ambitious at the present time to think that will all work out fairly quickly and fairly easily in the direction that Prime Minister Starmer has indicated.
Now, we know that various leaders of Europe have met in Paris today. The line from Keir Starmer coming after that meeting. Tomorrow, there is a meeting in Saudi Arabia between top-level US and Russian players, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State for the US, along with a similar counterpart from the US. They are going to be discussing a peace deal without Ukraine involved, of which Zelensky is, I'm sure, the president of Ukraine, a little bit miffed. He does not have a seat at the table. He is not keen on any peace deal that doesn't involve him. Now, that could come at a later stage. I wonder how you feel about the US and Russia meeting tomorrow without Ukraine, without any other country involved at all. Is that actually fair enough?
I think that up until now, in the previous administration, there has been a solid commitment on the part of the United States that there would be no agreement without Ukrainian participation, and that to seek to impose an agreement from the United States was not on. That now seemingly has shifted. It shifted first when President Trump, before inauguration, seemed to indicate that in 24 hours he would have this all wrapped up, which implied to many of us familiar with the area that that would mean that he was clearly on the path of bringing Ukraine along, perhaps by force. And that would obviously be contrary to commitments and contrary to international law, unless Ukraine, for reasons that at the moment seem more in the world of imagination than the world of reality, suddenly changed its mind. So that is just one of the many stumbling blocks in the path. The other include NATO membership and territorial agreements that, in fact, do not get anywhere near Ukraine's ambitions, goals, objectives of recovering the territory all lost within their 1991 boundaries.
All right. So, I mean, if I'm to just push you again, is it a good idea for those talks between the US and Russia to go ahead without any other country involved? Does that keep it, I don't know, cleaner and meaner, I suppose, more efficient? Having other countries involved just extends any negotiations out further? Or is this ignorant and short-sighted of them, perhaps even egotistical, to think that they can create a peace deal without the participation of some of the most important countries involved in this, the president of Ukraine among one of those figures who should be available?
You raise a very good question at that point. Certainly, these talks seem to be now becoming gilded, if I could put it this way, with the notion that they represent a change, a serious change in the failure of the US and Russia to have significant, meaningful conversations about any major subject, including both Ukraine and the Middle East. And if they move the question in the direction of opening communications, that may be useful. What you and I have pointed out here, however, is that at the moment, there are real barriers to seeming success around the corner, which may well take a lot of time to clear up and a lot of time and uncertainty to work out in a difficult process of negotiation. The Russians have said very firmly, both President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, that they're not moving on these key issues, that they're pretty much hung up on those, and that no NATO membership and no territorial concessions seem to be at the heart.
Yeah.
Two things that President Zelensky obviously has staked his objectives very clearly on reversing.
We've heard from US officials, speaking to Bloomberg, that President Trump wants to get this wrapped up by Easter. That is 60 odd days. How likely is that? Could a temporary peace solution be found by then? Is it even worth looking at a temporary peace solution, I suppose, or would that just be a holding pattern with then no incentive for a lasting peace?
There are a lot of uncertainties out ahead, and prophecy is a difficult subject, even with someone with a little bit of diplomatic experience. But I would say that the door is opened, but the conclusion seems to be a distant goal way down a long hall, perhaps with mirrors, which complicates the problem in diplomacy in a serious way. So 60 days or more is not, in my view, an situation that one could say, even given the fact it's 2 months, is closed with optimism or is very likely to occur. But President Trump has a great penchant for unpredictability and for uncertainty, and we'll just have to wait and see whether he can do it. The step has its positive advantages. The outcome remains very unclear and very problematic, and there are other factors, including exclusion of Europeans, that you all are very familiar with on your side of the ocean, that we follow very carefully. So there is, in fact, a mounting crescendo of what I would call actions which, in one way or another, the U.S. has seemingly directed Russian attention toward, but which do not look like they are very likely to be right around the corner with respect to either Ukraine or the European Union members, or Britain.
Very briefly, Thomas Pickering, as a former US ambassador to the United Nations, would the United Nations get involved with supplying a peacekeeping force, a non-partisan, a neutral peacekeeping force, to try and boost some of the boots on the ground needed in terms of peacekeepers, trying to sort of hold that peace on the Ukraine-Russian border?
It's been very much part of the process of peacemaking, and there have been peacekeepers in the Balkans, there are peacekeepers in the Middle East, peacekeepers elsewhere around the world, so it's not so far-fetched or so remote or distant. There are, beyond that, other questions that President Zelensky seems to be heavily focused on. His interest in membership in NATO is that he considers it the best guarantee of support were the Russians, as he might expect, buy into a deal which they don't keep much of what happened in the lead up to the present conflict. And as a result, he's very interested in things like U.S. commitments to provide the kind of necessary support in the event that the deal is not kept by the opposite party. And so not only leaving him out of the negotiations, at least at this stage, there are hints that he may be asked to be included and be included at later stages of the process, is, in a sense, from his point of view, clearly creating a bigger obstacle of uncertainty than he would wish to see at this particular point. And President Trump has made concessions, presumably in his telephone call with President Putin, which seemed to be unrequited by counter concessions on the part of the Russians, with the exception of be willing to attend the Riyadh meeting and perhaps to have a summit with President Trump. Some sources have said that might take place even in Moscow on May 9th, which is the end of World War II Victory Day,
Wow.
Celebrated pretty widely in Russia, and to which foreign leaders are often invited.
Thomas Pickering, thank you so much for being with us. Former
Thank
US
you, Kate.
ambassador to Russia and the United Nations. Good to speak to you. This is Kate Borsett. It's the evening edition on Times Radio. The US has capability that other European nations don't, which is why it's so important to have this security guarantee.
Yeah, so in the current sort of European security construct, the Americans play a fundamental role. They provide an awful lot of intelligence capability. They provide a lot of very sophisticated technical enablers, and they produce significant amounts of air power and naval and ground forces, whether forward-based in Europe or on call to come across from the continental United States. They have been the backbone of this organization to the point where, as we know, we wouldn't be having this conversation were this point not true, where European nations have been very complacent and relied over heavily on the Americans, hence this whole maelstrom, really. And in that sense, I think, Mr. Trump's absolutely right. He may be going about it in a strange way, but ultimately he's pointing out the error of our ways and giving us a chance now to rectify that in the specific context of this potential peacekeeping operation. And so the sorts of things they might be able to provide are intelligence, support to sophisticated communications, lots of arm's length capabilities, including air cover, for example. But we've had examples in the past where peacekeeping forces on the ground, take, for example, operations in the Balkans, were capped, if you like, with an umbrella of American air power, flying at pretty high altitudes, well out of the fight. And it's quite difficult for that sort of force to operate without tensions emerging. And that's what happened, fun enough, in the Balkans. And it was as a result of that, but tensions between the United Nations operations, which didn't really have any proper teeth, and the surrounding interest that led to a NATO operation, which did actually achieve a very significant effect, but only by threatening the use of artillery and airstrikes against the combatant forces of the various factions in Bosnia at the time in the mid-90s. So you can see a model where this might look good in theory, getting it to work in practice for a protracted period, where you've got parties that may be coming into this peacekeeping arrangement, this ceasefire arrangement, who aren't guaranteed to act in good faith. And I'm thinking of the Russians.
Who's that? Okay. All right. Yeah, but I mean, look, we could continue talking for hours and hours, but there are various, as the Times has been setting out, George Grills, the defence correspondent, there are various different scenarios that could happen in terms of sort of boots on the ground, if we're to simplify it down to that much. A UN peacekeeping force, if you like, as well. But then that would require a vote in the UN Security Council. Russia and China are both members, 2 of the 5 permanent members there, so they may not agree to that. I mean, look, clearly Keir Starmer's, trying to put a line in the sand, trying to put his sort of red line down, really, in terms of this US security guarantee. I just wonder on numbers. We've been noting a very interesting tweet from Mark Urban, who contributes to Times Radio, writes in the Times as well. And he talks about the fact that limited forces are available to secure a Ukraine peace deal. Britain may offer a UK-led brigade, 5,000-ish, he says, but this is likely to be made up of a single UK battle group and contingents from other countries, of course. The other armed forces could also chip in too. It's very hard, however you do it, he says, he sort of goes on to say, to see them getting close to the 110,000 force Zelensky says he wants. Macron's exploration of this a few months ago envisaged 40,000. That feels more realistic. Are we going to see later down the line here, to sort of summarise this, Sir Peter Wall, are we going to see difficulties in what President Zelensky feels he wants and what Europe can offer?
Yeah, I think there's definitely tension there. I think Europe lacks the wherewithal, and it might also lack the will to really front up what's necessary here. And coming to this point about how do you generate a force that can appear to be impartial, you're going to need to bring some forces in from other parts of the world. They may be able to generate the capability and the numbers. Can we then stitch that together into a workable force that can enforce a mandate?
Yeah. Look, thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you for your wisdom across this. Sir Peter Wall, former Chief of General Staff, head of the British Army from 2010 to 2014.